Okay, so we just walked through how Card and Kruger are going to try to estimate the effect of an increase in the minimum wage on fast food employment in New Jersey. Now we're going to talk through what it is they find and how to interpret those findings. So the big picture result that they find is that after the minimum wage went into effect, employment by franchise actually increased in New Jersey and decreased in Pennsylvania. And as a result of that, they're going to conclude that rather than resulting in decreased employment, the increased minimum wage, if anything, resulted in increased employment. Now, they're careful with this result, right? Because they say that it's possible that this happened by chance, right? The increase in employment they find isn't so large that they can rule out that they just got a lucky finding, but it's going to be definitely large enough to make a decrease in employment very, very unlikely as a result of this data, right? Now, at the same time, when they compare their high wage and low wage establishments within New Jersey, they're going to find the same thing, right? They're going to find that employment increased more in the low wage establishments in New Jersey than it did in the high wage establishments. As we talked about, because of the fact that our two different control groups have pretty different advantages and limitations, this is going to be pretty strong evidence that what they found is real, right? Stronger than if they got different results with their two different control groups. Okay, so first of all, let's walk through how they get this finding, right? So as we saw before the minimum wage went into effect, Pennsylvania stores had about 3 more workers on average than New Jersey's. After the minimum wage went into effect, the New Jersey stores increased their employment by about half a worker on average. Pennsylvania stores decreased their employment by about 2 workers on average. And so as a result, they ended up at the same level of employment, more or less, after the increase in the minimum. And so if we do this difference in difference estimation, right, what we're going to find is that the minimum wage is estimated to increase employment by 2.76, right? So if we do this in our standard table here, essentially what we can do, we can say right, New Jersey before the minimum wage was at 20.5, right? Pennsylvania was at, say, 23, right? Then after, New Jersey went down and Pennsylvania went down, right? And so when we compare the New Jersey difference between New Jersey and Pennsylvania before, we're going to see that the difference is going to be about 8, right? The difference after is about 0. Then 2.8 minus 0, right? So if it were the case that if not for the minimum wage increase, New Jersey would have seen the same change in employment as Pennsylvania, what we would want to conclude is that the minimum wage increase actually increased employment in New Jersey relative to Pennsylvania. Cool. Now, likewise, if we compare the high wage and low wage stores in New Jersey, we're going to draw a similar conclusion. Right, what we can see here is that the stores that were paying higher wages had higher levels of employment prior to the minimum wage increase, right? On average, they were employing a little more than 22 people, as opposed to a little less than 20 people, the stores that were paying exactly the minimum wage before the minimum wage increase. After the minimum wage increase, they all settled on a fairly similar number of employees, of a little 21 employees per store. And so as a result, we can say that employment increased by a little more than 1 person for the low wage stores, right? Decreased by about 2 people in the high wage stores. And so if we look at the difference in difference, we're going to estimate that the difference between basically the change in employment in the low wage stores relative to the high wage stores is about 3.36, right? And so what we're going to conclude is if we use the high wage stores as our control group, we're going to say that rather than having the minimum wage increase employment by 2.8 people, they're going to increase the employment by about 3.4 people. And because of the fact that we've got some uncertainty in these estimates, those are basically going to draw the same conclusion. The last thing that they do, right, is they take these results that they've gotten and they add a couple of controls, right? So they add controls for whether the store is owned by a franchise holder or owned by the corporation, right, add controls for what region of New Jersey the store is located in. And these controls make very, very little difference in the estimate. Okay. So our overall picture finding is that the minimum wage increased employment. The question is, how could we get to that? What model is going to give us that result? So the first thing we might want to think about is maybe this is just a data issue, right? Maybe we're going to make a wrong conclusion because we're measuring employment the wrong way. And the two ways that they're most concerned about here is first that stores might have replaced part-time workers with full-time workers. Because they're using, they're estimating some sort of full-time equivalent here by assuming that a part-time worker is some fraction of a full-time worker. If they got that fraction wrong, that could lead them to the wrong conclusion. The second thing they might worry about is maybe the stores increased their number of employees, but they reduced the number of hours each employee was working. So what they do is they do the same strategy, the same difference in different strategy with a couple of different outcomes, right? So the first thing they do is they say, how does the fraction of workers who are full-time change before and after the minimum wage increases? And indeed, they're going to find that when the minimum wage increased, the fraction of workers who are full-time increased in New Jersey and decreased in Pennsylvania, right? And increased in low-wage stores relative to high-wage stores. So that piece of their story does appear to be happening. At the same time, they're not going to find much evidence at all that stores change the number of hours that they're open, that they change the number of cash registers that they have, which is a proxy for how many workers they have working at any particular time, or the fraction of cash registers that are open at any particular time. So overall, they're not going to find much evidence that they're just mismeasuring. And when they change how many part-time workers count as a full-time equivalent worker, it's not going to have a significant effect on their result. So the second possibility, the second most straightforward possibility, is maybe demand for fast food meals is just very inelastic, right? So maybe it's fairly easy for New Jersey restaurants to pass on the increased costs to their consumers. This couldn't really explain this positive effect on employment, but maybe that was just luck of the draw, right? Maybe they're wrong to conclude it's just a fluke that employment went up in these low-wage New Jersey stores, but employment didn't go down because the low-wage New Jersey stores were able to raise their prices in order to fully accommodate this increase in labor costs, right? This is a classic Marshall's law of demand, right? If you have very inelastic demand for burgers, then when you have an increase in the price of workers, it's just going to increase the price of the product. And they're going to find some evidence for this, right? If they look at the change in the price of a meal, they're going to find that indeed the price of meals went up in New Jersey relative to Pennsylvania. When they do the calculations, they're going to argue that the increase in prices between New Jersey and Pennsylvania was large enough to fully account for the increase in labor costs. In other words, the balance sheet for the franchises didn't necessarily change very much as a result of these higher wages, right? All that the minimum wage did is it increased the earnings of workers at the expense of increasing prices for customers. On the other hand, when we compare the relatively low price and relatively high priced establishments within New Jersey, we're going to find some evidence that prices went up in the relatively low wage establishments at the beginning, relative to the relatively high wage establishments, but not very strong evidence. And the increase in prices is not going to be big enough to account for the differences, to basically absorb the differences in pay. So there's some evidence that this might be about inelastic demand, but this doesn't fully explain the story that we get. In particular, it can't really explain this increase in employment. Okay. So what could explain an increase in employment is employer market power, right? As we talked about in the theory section of this lecture, if these fast food franchises have market power over their employees, in other words, if employees aren't fully indifferent between working at one establishment versus another, right, because they've got different commute times, because they're not aware of the availability of jobs in other establishments, because they have friends that they want to work with, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we might expect that a small increase in the minimum wage could in fact increase employment. The problem with this is that if that was the case, that increased employment should result in increased output, right? We generally expect the reason that you hire workers is because they produce a product. Higher levels of employment should mean higher levels of output. Higher levels of output should mean lower prices, right? If all of the different fast food franchises are all raising the amount that they're producing, increasing the number of hours that they're open, et cetera, at the same time, we might expect that the prices that they're able to charge are going to go down. And so the evidence that we saw before are using against a monopsony explanation because of the fact that we saw price increases rather than price. Now, another thing that we could do to test for this monopsony power explanation is we could say, if we've got a monopsonistic firm, right, what we expect is a picture like this, right? Hire L star workers and a wage W star. And so what we expect is that firms want to hire more workers than they're actually able to hire, right? In other words, we're going to expect that firms are going to be facing a labor shortage. So one of the things that they do is they say, if this is a monopsony story, we should see evidence that the firms that increased their employment the most are the ones that were relatively supply constrained. In other words, the ones that were trying to actively recruit new workers. The way that they did that is they looked at whether each store offered a bonus to employees that brought in a friend, right? Employees that recruited new employees for the store as an indication that the store was supply constrained. And what they find is that the stores that offered those bonuses have the same employment changes as the stores that didn't offer. So that's, again, a little bit of evidence against the idea that what we're seeing is about monopsony. All right. Another possibility, right, is that this is about non-wage amenities. Maybe the reason that these restaurants didn't have to reduce employment, again, right, this isn't going to explain an increase in employment, but it could explain a lack of reduction in employment. Maybe the reason that they didn't reduce employment when they increased wages is because of the fact that they reduced other forms of compensation, right? So maybe they made the working conditions a little bit less pleasant, right? They reduce employee benefits in some way. So there's two kinds of employee benefits that they can look for and see evidence that these were reduced. The first is they can look at whether stores were offering their employees free or reduced price meals while they were working, right? This is a common thing in a lot of fast food franchises. And it's a pretty significant perk that you get from working at one of these. The second thing that they could look at indirectly is whether the stores were offering their employees on-the-job training, which is another important non-wage benefit you can get from working. And the way that they're going to look for on-the-job training is they're going to say, are you receiving wage increases and bonuses as you work longer, which is evidence that you're becoming more productive for the firm. What they're going to find is that by and large, they're not going to see very much evidence, right? So if they look at the availability of low-priced meal programs, they're going to see that while fewer New Jersey establishments reduced the number of reduced price meal programs that they offered, they increased the number of free meal programs that they offered relative to Pennsylvania. So if we compare all the stores that are offering free or reduced price meal programs, there's actually an increase in the number in New Jersey relative to Pennsylvania. On the other hand, if we compare the stores that had a high wage gap to the stores that had a low wage gap, right? So we want to know, are these stores that were offering low wages to begin with more or less likely to provide free or reduced price meal programs? What we're going to see is that the low wage stores increase the number of free programs, decrease the number of low price programs relative to the high wage stores in New Jersey. The overall effect is going to be negative, but it's going to be indistinguishable from zero. So in other words, we're not seeing much evidence in either case, some suggestive evidence when we compare high and low wage establishments, but no evidence when we compare New Jersey and Pennsylvania that there's a reduction in this employee perk. On the other hand, when we look at the change in the wage profile, right? So we say, how long is what's the, if we graph your wages over time, what's the slope of your wage profile? What amount of raise do you receive? On none of these indications are we going to see much evidence for either New Jersey versus Pennsylvania or high wage versus low wage establishments in New Jersey that we're going to have a change in the amount of on-the-job training or a change in the wage profile that workers are receiving. So overall, this isn't much evidence that what we're seeing is a reduction in employee benefits. Now, of course, there's potentially numerous kinds of employee benefits that aren't being captured here, right? We don't know, for example, if your boss is more likely to yell at you for texting with your friends. Well, this was 1992 for, talking into a can with a string on it with your friends, right? But we can say that for these observable kinds of benefits that would be likely to be cut if employers have more workers than they know what to do with, we're not going to see much evidence of those cuts. Okay, so in the last video in this series, I'm going to go through some of the conclusions that we can try to draw on the evidence that we've seen so far, right, from Card and Kruger's paper.